Hey guys, one of the most critical skills in chess, if you want to win games, which is the whole point of chess, is to know how to spot potential winning opportunities and to go in for the kill. So what I've got for this video is 5 endings from games, all games that I've played today. Some I win, some I lose. And what I'd like you to do is to have a look at this and think, okay, if it was me to move, what would I do next? And see if you can spot winning opportunities. They may not be the absolute best ways to finish the game, but a win is always a win. So here's the first one. So my opponent's rated just under 1400. I'm playing with the black pieces. Now I am up a knight. But my opponent has 1 extra pawn, okay, which is currently guarded by my king. However, I have 2 pawns here that are looking very, very vulnerable. So, you're black to move, and you want to force a checkmate if you possibly can. So, the first thing to notice is, well, if you can set up forcing moves that mean that your opponent has to respond, then maybe you would be able to prevent the rook from grabbing these pawns, okay? Because that would make life difficult. So what do you notice about the position? Well, so white's king has just moved here. So it's on the side of the board. This square is not available to the king because of both the pawn there and also this knight. The knight is also covering g2, so the king can't go there either. So what we have is something similar to like a back rank mate, which you've probably seen. You've probably inflicted them on other people and fallen foul of them yourself, where, for example, the king might be on the back rank and have, say, 3 pawns in front of it, or pieces, and it can only move on the back rank. And then if like a rook or a queen gets onto the back rank, that can be an instant checkmate. So we have something similar here, with this knight in particular guarding these 2 squares, right? So the move I played was simply rook d1, and I'm threatening rook h1, which would be checkmate, because my opponent doesn't have any of those squares and cannot move on the h file. Okay, so that means that white now doesn't have time to capture this pawn. So he plays king there. Now I throw in a check, right? And the king moves back. And now, key move, knight to g4. Okay, so the king now can't go here because of the rook, but the knight is also protecting that square. So now the threat is rook h2, and that again would be checkmate. King can't take the knight, can't move there. So white has to respond again. King h4, trying to get out of the way. Now rook to h2. The king does have an escape square, but again, there is another issue, right? All of these squares are covered by the pawns. All of these squares are covered by the rook. The pawn is defending the knight so the king can't go there, which leaves only one potential square for the king to go to, which would be to capture the pawn on f5. Okay, so in my move, I think, would that even have been checkmate straight away? I think it probably would. But I actually play g6, and now the rook comes across to attack my king. King just moves diagonally next to the rook. Now the rook cannot check again. So the rook moves out of the way, and then rook to h5 is checkmate. But I believe that I didn't even need to do that one. That would have been check. No, of course the king could have actually captured the rook there. So I did need to move the pawn. Okay, that's example number 1. Let's move on to game 2. In this instance, we have a very sharp position, and now it's white. Again, I'm playing black. White has the extra knight, but I have the extra pawn. And I've just moved my rook from d8 to d2, and I'm threatening to capture this pawn. And if I do that, the king will have to move one way or another, but can't go here because I would move my other rook across, and that would actually be checkmate. So we could actually have a perpetual check situation with my rooks just chasing the king backwards and forwards on that back rank. Now, what white plays here is rook to g8 check, and I simply move my king to a7. And my opponent actually here sent me a message saying, is there a checkmate here? Right? And I replied, no, there isn't a checkmate for either of us. And I think I offered a draw, which my opponent declined. Now this is a beautiful ending, a really, really good ending. Okay, so clearly my opponent has to keep checking me, or else if I get the next check in, then I can force a draw. So he plays knight to c8 check. I can't go here because that square is also governed by the knight, so I have to go back onto the back rank, and now the knight moves out of the way, okay, with a discovered check from the rook. So I only have one move. I go back to a7, and it looks like this might just carry on forever. Now we have rook here, and I check white's king. King moves there, I check again. Now a king moves to the e file, and the interesting thing about the e file is that it has a rook on it, right? So if I put my rook there with check, he simply captures my rook for free, because he's got 2 attackers against that square, and I would only have 1 defender. So I move my rook across here and get ready for this ending. Okay, knight to c8 check. Okay, I have 2 squares where I can go. So king goes now to b8, and now knight to b6 again. I move my king back here, right? Is this ever going to end? But yes, bang! Beautiful, beautiful finish. With his knight on there, I can't capture the knight because it's protected by a rook. Now rook a8, what a checkmate. That must have been very, very satisfying. Wasn't for me. Okay, game number 3. So this, in this situation, material is equal. I'm playing now with the white pieces. Black has just moved his rook up to e5, so he's got 2 attackers against this pawn. Now, you need to recognize that black's king is somewhat vulnerable. So what I need to do now is I need to break through, because there's a lot of pieces around in this corner. The pawns are pretty much locked off. Rook is maybe attacking that pawn, which is currently protected by the queen, and we have 2 attackers on this pawn. So now it's white to play, and we want to force a win. Okay, so my first move is rook h5, so I'm adding another defender to this pawn. So now black cannot capture. The other thing that this move does is it enables me maybe to double my rooks. And we also notice that I have a bishop looking at this pawn on h6. So I could potentially double my rooks, even triple up by putting the queen on the h-file as well, and possibly bludgeon my way through. So here we have the queen moves out of the way to be a second attacker on this. Is that wise? Okay, so I double my rooks now on the h-file. Now rook moves across, don't know, protecting that pawn, or maybe giving the king one more square it can go to. And now I go in with the bishop. Now if bishop captures, we have rook captures, and I have a fork on the king and the queen, which would be winning. So the bishop can't capture. King moves out of the way. I take bishop. King takes. Rook g1. Now, if you can see better finishes than this, then please do feel free to comment. Okay, and rook in there, and now simply rook to h6 is going to win the queen. King moves out of the way. Grab the queen, and now I move my queen up to f4. So this rook is pinned, and the game is going to end very soon. And at this point, my opponent resigns. Ready for game number 4. How are your deadly killer blow instincts coming along? Okay, here I've got the black pieces. My opponent's rated 1500, and my king's looking fairly safe. Let's see what... So I've just moved my knight back here just to be an extra defender. My opponent has no pawn on the f-file. So life is looking all right. We've all that's been traded so far is a pawn from each of us. And now we have queen to d2. Now I play knight in here to attack this bishop there. But I've missed something. I've missed something very important. I took 3 seconds over that move. Right? I was playing fast. I was playing fluid. This, I think, is a 10-minute rapid game. I've got 7 minutes 51 seconds still on the clock. Okay, what did I miss? And if you were white, your spider senses should bing right now. Okay, can you see what white does next? Bishop takes h6. Bishop takes, queen takes. Okay, and now, okay, I'm figuring, okay, I've lost a pawn. I'll move my knight out to here, so I attack the queen, right? Bishop takes knight, I recapture, knight in here, and there is no way of escaping. My king cannot get away. It's penned in by its own pieces. The queen is very awkward here on e8. So whatever I do, queen to h7, a very, very simple, straightforward checkmate from a position where I just did not sense the danger at all. So if you go back to here, so with the queen moving here, you always have to ask the question, why did my opponent play that move? Yes, he's connecting his rooks on the back rank, but I should have seen, right, one attacker and a second attacker against the pawn that only has one defender, and it's a very, very important pawn. So that move, completely pointless. I could have played my knight here, possibly, but then again, he could have traded it off with his bishop. I could maybe have pushed g5, but as it happens, you know, my spider senses let me down in that one. Okay, let's move on to the fifth and final finish. This is very satisfying end. So in this situation, I'm playing white. My opponent has an extra bishop, but I am up 3 pawns. So material is numerically equal. The question is, can my opponent make full advantage of his extra piece and neutralize the advantage I have with my extra pawns? So I've just checked the king here. Need to be careful to stay off these dark squares. And the king now moves to e5. So there is no very, very rapid checkmate here, but the ending is definitely something that you should check out. So now I play f4, bringing my pawns together. I want them working together. I don't want this guy stuck there on his own. It comes with check. The king can't go to any of these squares, so only has 2 options. And the king moves here, attacking the rook. Now the rook comes across to attack the bishop. Bishop now moves. And we have another check with a pawn. So what I'm really wanting to make use of these 2 passed pawns if I possibly can, because that is my big advantage in the game. King moves across, check. King moves across, push the pawn. Rook comes across. Now I could have just grabbed the material here, but in fact this pawn's kind of acting as a shield for me on that side. Maybe black might have ideas of bringing his rook round and then to a1 there, because that would actually be mate. So we need to prevent that option from happening. Now, when you've got 2 pawns in an arrangement like this, okay, they are guarding all 4 of these squares. So now rook to here means that the king cannot stay on the 7th rank and also cannot move to the 6th rank because of these side-by-side pawns. Very, very powerful. When you have pawns side by side like that, the way that they create an impenetrable force field for the king, very, very useful. So the king now moves to the back rank. Now I figure, calculation time, okay? If So now I have the opportunity of playing rook to b8, king moves, and I can exchange rooks, right? That is going to leave the king on this square. And the question now is, do I have time to get around? See, this bishop is actually untouchable now because it's defended by this pawn and in turn is defending the pawn. So these pawns are out of the game, and that leaves me with 1, 2, 3 pawns still in the game. Now, if I exchange rooks and leave the king on this square here, can I maybe promote a pawn before this king from here can get round and snatch these 2 pawns? Because remember, if my rook's going to be off the board, then I can't quarantine the king, on right there on the back rank, which would be nice. Okay, so I figure, from here, I figure he's got 1, 2, because remember he can't go on any of these squares, 3, 4. 4 moves to capture the first pawn. But after 3 moves, okay, so forget about this one, I could actually push the pawn to here, and then he's got 4, 5. Okay, so it's going to take him 5 moves to capture one of my pawns. And what can I do in 5 moves? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, because I can't go on this square. 4, 5. So in 5 moves, I can get to the pawn. That's the idea. Anyway, so we'll see how it finishes. Ah, yes, lovely in between move. So this is what I realized. When the king moved to that square, right? Because he moved to that square, I can now play a check. So I can advance the f pawn. To me, I think the king should have moved in this direction because it needed to come round the side or round the back of these pawns in order to capture. But this allows me to throw in a check. Now the king goes there. Now I capture. King captures knight. I take this pawn. Okay, and now it's a foot race. I'm keeping my pawns side by side, right? That means that all of these squares are inaccessible to the king. So again, he's going to be forced to come round the long way, and he hasn't got time to do it. Bishop there, check. King up, and now I'm running with my b-pawn. Now the bishop is fortunately covering this promotion square there. Now I'm moving my king in, right, with intent. Now king to d5, this is a crucial square that I had to get to defend these pawns. Now these pawns are safe for the time being. So we've got lots of threats going on. Bishop comes back, but that means that the bishop is no longer protecting this. So I guess he's got ideas of putting the bishop in there. Okay, so the pawn comes forward. Bishop now comes back, so maybe he can come to here and still defend that square. I move the king, crucially, to e4 in order to prevent the bishop coming there. And now, when you draw the square, okay, the square from the pawn to its queening or promotion square, right? Same width and height. Now the king would have to get into this square now in order to prevent my pawn from promoting. But he didn't, he grabbed the pawn there, and now he can't actually stop the promotion. And there we go, and that is the end of the game. So very interesting, I thought, that one, to make the decision to swap off the rooks, to neutralize my opponent's rook, thinking that I should have time to promote one of my pawns against the extra bishop on the other side. So very, very proud of that conversion. I haven't analysed this. There may have been a better route, but I thought I'd share this with you. I think all of us need to practice. I think puzzles can be really, really good for this, but practice being able to spot those significant advantages and significant threats against your opponent or even against yourself, because it will simply help you to win more games. It's as simple as that. So I hope that these 5 little examples have been interesting, open your eyes just a little bit. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do. See you soon.